Pick any wife for free, the corrupt judge laughed, his fat finger stabbing through dusty air toward the trembling girl. I'll take the obese black girl. The crowd roared with cruel delight as she stood frozen in the town square, a seamstress reduced to public mockery. Everyone knew her fate, a lifetime of degradation at the hands of the most vicious man in Texas. But from the shadows stepped a weathered mountain man, his calloused hands slapping down silver coins. I'll take her instead. The judge's laughter died. What none of them knew was that this girl carried secrets worth killing for, secrets that had already claimed her father's life, secrets that could topple the corrupt empire built on stolen land and forged deeds. Would the mountain man's intervention save her, or had he just signed both their death warrants? The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Millbrook, Texas. Magnolia Dean pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried toward the seamstress shop. The wooden sign creaked in the hot wind. She kept her eyes down, hoping to avoid the usual stares and whispers. Judge Theodore Greeley's booming voice echoed from the courthouse steps. A crowd had gathered around makeshift wooden platforms. Magnolia's stomach dropped. She recognized the setup from last year's humiliating spectacle. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our annual charity drive for the unmarried women of our fair town, Judge Greeley announced. His gold tooth glinted as he smiled. These poor souls need our Christian generosity to find proper homes. Magnolia tried to slip past the growing crowd. A firm hand grabbed her arm. Deputy Collins dragged her toward the platform despite her protests. All eligible ladies must participate, he said. Town ordinance. She found herself standing with 3 other women on the wooden platform. The crowd began to murmur and point. Someone threw a pebble that bounced off her skirt. Laughter rippled through the gathering. Ruth Marlowe watched from the boarding house porch across the square. Her weathered face showed concern. She had run the boarding house for 30 years and seen every kind of cruelty this town could devise. But today felt different, dangerous. From the edge of the crowd, a tall stranger observed the proceedings. Silas Blackwell had arrived in Millbrook 3 days ago. His horse bore the dust of many miles. His eyes never left the platform where Magnolia stood. Judge Greeley raised his hands for silence. Now then, which of our generous bachelors will step forward to provide these ladies with proper Christian homes? The crowd erupted in cruel laughter. Someone shouted an obscene suggestion. Another man made exaggerated gestures about Magnolia's size. She felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. Jasper Tannen leaned close to Judge Greeley's ear. Make sure this wraps up quickly. The railroad representatives arrive next week. We can't have any distractions. The judge nodded and surveyed the crowd with theatrical flair. His gaze lingered on Magnolia with obvious malice. She had always been his favorite target. Her dignity in the face of humiliation seemed to enrage him. Come now, gentlemen. Surely someone has Christian charity in their heart, Judge Greeley continued. Think of it as a public service. More laughter. Someone in the crowd made barnyard noises. Magnolia's hands trembled, but she kept her chin raised. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Ruth Marlowe's fingers tightened around the porch railing. She remembered another face. Another time. The resemblance was unmistakable to anyone who had known Marcus Dean, but Marcus was dead, had been for 15 years, supposedly. Silas Blackwell stepped forward slightly. His hand rested on the leather satchel at his side. Inside were letters, documents, proof of things that would shake this town to its foundations. But timing was everything. Perhaps we need more incentive, Judge Greeley said. His voice took on a more sinister tone. After all, charity should be its own reward. He walked along the platform like a man inspecting livestock. The other 3 women shrank back when he approached. Magnolia stood perfectly still. She had learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. The crowd grew restless. Some began to drift away, bored by the lack of volunteers. Judge Greeley's face reddened. His carefully orchestrated humiliation was losing its audience. Very well then, he announced loudly. If no one will step forward voluntarily, perhaps I should set an example of Christian charity myself. Ruth Marlowe stood up from her chair. Something in the judge's tone sent ice through her veins. She had heard that tone before. The night Marcus Dean died, Judge Greeley spread his arms wide and grinned at the crowd. "Pick any wife for free," he laughed, pointing directly at Magnolia. "I'll take the obese black girl." The crowd roared with renewed interest. This was the entertainment they had come for. Magnolia felt the world tilt around her. The judge's yellow eyes gleamed with triumph, but before anyone could move, a deep voice cut through the laughter. "I'll take her instead." Silas Blackwell stepped into the circle of onlookers. Silver coins glinted in his weathered hand. The crowd fell silent. Judge Greeley's smile faltered. "Excuse me," the judge said. "I said I'll take her." Silas dropped the coins onto the platform. They rang like bells in the sudden quiet. "That covers the charity donation, doesn't it?" Ruth Marlowe sank back into her chair. The moment she had dreaded for 15 years had finally arrived. The past was about to collide with the present, and Magnolia Dean was about to discover who she really was. If you are enjoying this story of how one stranger's intervention will change Magnolia's fate forever, don't forget to comment where you are tuning in from to show how this story can connect us across any distances, backgrounds, and hearts. Because what will happen in the next 15 minutes in Millbrook will completely reveal secrets that have been buried for 15 years. The boarding house room felt smaller than a jail cell. Magnolia sat rigid in the wooden chair, watching Silas Blackwell pace near the window. Ruth Marlowe poured tea with shaking hands. The silence stretched like a bowstring. "You don't have to be afraid," Silas said finally. His voice was gentler than his mountain man appearance suggested. Magnolia laughed bitterly. "Every man who's ever said that to me was lying. I knew your father." The teacup slipped from Ruth's fingers. It shattered against the floor. Magnolia's breath caught in her throat. "My father was a field hand, died when I was 3. The words came out flat and rehearsed. Silas reached into his leather satchel. He pulled out a small daguerreotype. The image showed a well-dressed man in a fine suit standing beside a courthouse. The resemblance to Magnolia was unmistakable. Marcus Dean, attorney at law, graduated from Howard University in 1852. Magnolia stared at the photograph. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The man's eyes held the same quiet intelligence she saw in her mirror each morning. "That's impossible," she whispered. Ruth knelt to collect the broken pieces of china. Her movements were slow and deliberate. "Tell her the rest, Mr. Blackwell." Silas sat down across from Magnolia. "Your father was investigating land fraud cases across Texas. Someone didn't want him to succeed." The room seemed to spin around Magnolia. Everything she had been told about her life was crumbling like old paper. "He was murdered 15 years ago, right here in Millbrook." Ruth stood up with the broken china in her apron. "I helped hide you that night. You were 7 years old, scared out of your mind." Memories flickered at the edges of Magnolia's consciousness. A man's voice reading to her from law books, games that taught her letters and numbers, whispered lessons about justice and right and wrong. "The bedtime stories," she said slowly, "about the brave lawyer who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Your father wanted you to understand the law, even as a child." Silas opened his satchel again. This time he pulled out a thick folder wrapped in oilcloth. "He left these for you: case files, evidence, documentation of every crooked land deal in 3 counties. Magnolia's hands shook as she unwrapped the folder. Page after page of meticulous notes filled her vision: property deeds, survey maps, legal briefs written in her father's careful handwriting. "Judge Greeley has been stealing land for decades," Silas continued, "forging documents, bribing officials. Your father was close to exposing everything when they killed him." Ruth sat down heavily in her chair. "I've been watching over you ever since, waiting for the right time." "Why now?" Magnolia asked. "Because they're planning something big. Railroads coming through. They want every piece of land in the valley." Magnolia studied the documents with growing understanding. The legal terminology made perfect sense. Her father's training had never left her, even buried under years of survival and fear. These families, she said, pointing to a list of names, they're all still here, still being cheated. Your father died trying to help them. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Magnolia looked up from the papers. For the first time in 15 years, she felt something other than resignation. A spark of purpose flickered in her chest. I remember more now, she said quietly. He used to have me read contracts aloud, said the law was music if you knew how to hear it. Silas leaned forward. I was a detective back then, worked with your father on several cases. He was the smartest legal mind I ever met. And the most dangerous to men like Judge Greeley, Ruth added. Magnolia spread the documents across the small table. Property maps revealed a clear pattern. Widows losing farms after mysterious accidents befell their husbands. Immigrants signing contracts they couldn't read. Former slaves intimidated into selling land for pennies. Look at this, she said, pointing to a survey map. These property lines don't match the official records at the courthouse. Silas studied the documents over her shoulder. Your father suspected massive forgery, but he needed more proof. The proof is in the courthouse, Magnolia said. In the official land records, if we can compare them to these original surveys. Ruth shook her head. Too dangerous. Judge Greeley watches those records like a hawk. Then we'll have to be smarter than he is. The words surprised everyone in the room, including Magnolia herself. But as she spoke them, she felt her father's teachings rising to the surface. All those childhood games had been preparation for this moment. There's something else, Ruth said quietly. The night your father died, I saw who came to town. Railroad men. They met with Judge Greeley and Jasper Tannen at the saloon. Silas went very still. The same railroad that's coming through next week. The very same. Magnolia looked between them. The pieces were falling into place like a legal argument building toward its conclusion. They killed him to clear the way for this railroad deal, she said. Everything that's happened since has been about covering their tracks and stealing more land. And now they're close to finishing what they started, Silas said grimly. Magnolia closed the folder of documents. Her father's life work rested in her hands. 15 years of injustice demanded an answer. Then it's time to finish what my father started. Outside the boarding house, Judge Greeley's carriage rolled past. Inside the room, 3 people began planning the downfall of the most corrupt man in Texas. 3 nights later, Magnolia crept through the courthouse shadows. Her father's legal training guided every step. Silas waited by the back entrance while she worked the lock with tools Ruth had provided. The old woman knew more secrets than either of them had imagined. Inside, moonlight filtered through dusty windows. The land records office sat behind a heavy oak door. Magnolia's heart hammered as she struck a match. The flame revealed rows of leather-bound record books stretching from floor to ceiling. She pulled the first volume and opened it carefully. Property transfers dating back 20 years filled the yellowed pages. Her trained eye caught discrepancies immediately. Dates that didn't align. Signatures that looked suspiciously similar across different transactions. The match burned down to her fingers. She lit another and continued reading. Page after page of evidence unfolded before her. Judge Greeley's corruption went deeper than even her father had suspected. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on the courthouse steps. She blew out the match and pressed herself against the wall. The footsteps passed. Judge Greeley's voice drifted through the night air as he spoke with someone near the jail. Magnolia waited until the voices faded. Then she lit another match and returned to work. She found the property records for the Henderson farm. According to the official documents, Old Man Henderson had sold his land to Jasper Tannen 3 months before his death. But Magnolia remembered attending Henderson's funeral as a child. He had died in a wagon accident 2 years ago. The implications hit her like a physical blow. They were backdating property transfers, creating false sales records for dead men who could never contradict the lies. She pulled another volume. The Wilson homestead, the Martinez ranch, the Jackson family farm, every property showed the same pattern. Mysterious accidents followed by convenient land sales that had never actually happened. Her father's notes had been accurate, but the scope of the fraud was even larger than he had documented. Hundreds of acres, dozens of families, a systematic theft that had been going on for decades. Magnolia carefully copied key information onto paper she had brought: property descriptions, transfer dates, signature samples, evidence that would stand up in any honest court. The courthouse door creaked open downstairs. Heavy boots echoed across the wooden floors. Someone was making rounds. Magnolia blew out her match and held her breath. The footsteps moved through the building methodically, getting closer to the records office. She gathered her papers and moved toward the window. It opened onto the courthouse roof. Her only escape route. The window stuck. Years of paint and humidity had sealed it tight. The footsteps stopped outside the records office door. A key turned in the lock. Magnolia threw her shoulder against the window frame. It gave way with a loud crack. She tumbled onto the slanted roof as the door opened behind her. "Someone's been in here," Deputy Collins called out. Magnolia pressed herself flat against the shingles, her papers scattered in the wind. She managed to grab most of them before they blew away. One sheet fluttered down toward the street. "Check the window," another voice ordered. She recognized Judge Greeley's tone. He had come to check on his stolen records personally. That told her everything about how worried he was becoming. Magnolia crawled across the roof toward the back of the building. Silas waited in the alley below. She dropped her papers down to him first. Then she lowered herself over the edge and fell the last few feet into his arms. They ran through the darkened streets without speaking. Behind them, lantern light flickered in the courthouse windows as the judge's men searched for intruders. Back at the boarding house, Ruth waited with coffee and worried expressions. Magnolia spread her copied documents across the kitchen table. The evidence painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a property transfer. "The Kowalski farm. Official records show they sold to Tannen last month. But I saw Mrs. Kowalski at the general store yesterday. She has no idea her land has been sold." Silas studied the signature samples. Same handwriting across multiple supposed sellers. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Ruth examined the property descriptions. "These boundary lines have been altered too. Look how the ink color changes mid-sentence." Magnolia felt her father's legal mind awakening fully. The patterns were clear once you knew what to look for, but proving it in court would require more than copied documents. "We need witness testimony," she said. "People who can confirm they never sold their land." "That means approaching the families directly," Silas warned. "Word will get back to Greeley." "Let it. We're past the point of hiding now." Ruth poured more coffee with shaking hands. "There's something else you should know. I've been keeping records of my own." She disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a wooden box. Inside were newspaper clippings, letters, and detailed notes spanning 15 years. Every suspicious death, every convenient accident, every family that lost their land under mysterious circumstances. Magnolia spread Ruth's documentation alongside her father's files and her own courthouse discoveries. The complete picture emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. "Judge Greeley has been murdering people for their land," she said quietly. "My father was just one of many." The three of them sat in silence as the magnitude of the crime sank in. This wasn't just fraud. It was a reign of terror disguised as legal proceedings. "The railroad representatives arrive in 4 days," Silas said finally. "Once they complete their land purchases, the evidence disappears forever." Magnolia looked at the documents covering the table. Her father's life work, Ruth's patient documentation, her own dangerous investigation. It all led to this moment. "Then we have 4 days to expose 15 years of murder and theft." Outside, the first light of dawn crept over Millbrook. Somewhere in the distance, Judge Greeley was planning his next move. But for the first time since her father's death, Magnolia Dean was ready to fight back. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Ruth's boarding house. Magnolia watched from the kitchen window as a black carriage rolled down the street. The horses bore expensive tack. The driver wore a uniform she didn't recognize. 3 men in fine Eastern suits stepped out. They moved with the confident stride of people accustomed to getting their way. Railroad representatives 2 days early. "They're here," she called to Silas and Ruth. Silas joined her at the window. His face went grim as he studied the newcomers. "Northern Pacific Railroad. I recognize the tall one. Name's Harrison Webb. He specializes in land acquisition." "Meaning he steals it legally," Ruth said from the doorway. The men walked directly to Judge Greeley's office. No hesitation. They knew exactly where they were going. This visit had been planned for months, possibly years. Magnolia felt time slipping away like sand through her fingers. They had counted on 4 more days to build their case. Now everything had to happen faster. "We need to approach the affected families today," she said, "before the railroad completes their purchases." Silas shook his head. "Too dangerous. If Greeley realizes we're organizing resistance, he'll take drastic action." More drastic than murder? The question hung in the air like smoke. They all knew Judge Greeley's methods. Anyone who threatened his land scheme ended up dead or disappeared. Ruth pulled on her shawl. "I'll visit the families. They trust me. They'll listen." "No," Magnolia said firmly. "This is my fight, my father's legacy. I won't hide behind others anymore." She gathered the copied documents and her father's case files. The legal training that had been buried for 15 years rose to the surface like a natural instinct. Their first stop was the Kowalski farm 3 miles outside town. Anna Kowalski was hanging laundry when they approached. Her face showed the weariness of a woman fighting battles she couldn't win. "Mrs. Kowalski," Magnolia began, "according to courthouse records, you sold your farm to Jasper Tannen last month." Anna's face went white. "That's impossible. This farm belonged to my husband. I would never sell." Magnolia showed her the forged documents. Anna's signature appeared at the bottom of a sale contract she had never seen. "Someone stole my name," Anna whispered. "How is this legal?" "It isn't," Magnolia replied, "but proving it requires courage." Anna looked across her fields. Crops her husband had planted before his death in a suspicious barn fire. Everything they had worked for their entire lives. "What do you need me to do?" The Martinez ranch was their second stop. Carlos Martinez had lost his leg in a wagon accident that destroyed his ability to work the land. According to the documents, he had immediately sold to Tannen for a fraction of the property's value. "I never signed anything," Carlos insisted. "Tannen came here with papers, but I refused to sell. Told him this land would go to my sons." His wife Maria nodded vigorously. "We threw him off the property. Told him never to come back." Yet the courthouse records showed a completed sale dated that same week. Another impossible transaction that existed only on paper. The Henderson widow lived in a small cabin near the river. She broke down crying when Magnolia showed her the forged sale documents. "They killed my husband for this land," she sobbed. "His wagon accident wasn't no accident. I seen the brake line was cut." "Will you testify to that?" Magnolia asked gently. "If it means justice for my Henry, I'll testify to anything." By evening, they had visited 8 families. Every story was the same. Mysterious accidents, forged documents, property stolen through fraudulent legal proceedings. But as they rode back toward town, Silas spotted riders behind them. 3 men keeping their distance but clearly following their movements. "Greeley knows what we're doing," he said. They took a longer route back to the boarding house, trying to lose their pursuers. The riders stayed with them, professional and patient. Ruth was waiting with disturbing news. "Jasper Tannen came by looking for you, asked a lot of questions about your background. He seemed scared." "Scared of what?" "That's what worries me." That night, Magnolia couldn't sleep. She sat by the window studying her father's case files by lamplight. Something nagged at her about the timeline of events. The railroad's involvement, the systematic nature of the land theft. She pulled out Ruth's documentation and cross-referenced it with the courthouse records. A pattern emerged that made her blood run cold. The murders and accidents weren't random. They followed the planned route of the railroad line exactly. Every piece of stolen property sat directly in the path of the proposed tracks. Someone had provided the railroad company with detailed maps years in advance. Someone who knew exactly which properties needed to be acquired and in what order. But the railroad survey maps weren't public information. They would have been confidential company documents, available only to high-level executives and government officials. Magnolia spread all the documents across the floor and studied them like a vast puzzle. The scope of the conspiracy became clear. This wasn't just local corruption. Judge Greeley and Jasper Tannen were taking orders from someone much more powerful, someone with connections to the federal government and the railroad industry. The door creaked open. Silas entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Can't sleep either." "Look at this," she said, pointing to the timeline. The land theft started 5 years before the railroad announced their route through Texas. Silas studied the documents. His detective instincts kicked in immediately. Inside information. Someone in Washington told them exactly where the tracks would go, and gave them a list of properties to acquire by any means necessary. They stared at each other as the implications sank in. They weren't just fighting local corruption. They were up against a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and industry. Outside, riders circled the boarding house in the darkness. The real enemy had finally revealed itself. Dawn brought an unexpected visitor to Ruth's boarding house. Jasper Tannen stood on the front porch, hat in hand, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. His usual arrogance had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. Magnolia watched from behind the curtains as Ruth opened the door. Tannen's voice carried through the morning air, urgent and desperate. "I need to speak with them, please. My family's in danger." Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. Tannen entered like a man walking to his own execution. His hands shook as he removed his hat. Silas emerged from the kitchen with his hand near his gun. "This better not be a trick, Tannen." "No trick. I'm done with tricks." Tannen's voice cracked. "They took my wife and daughter yesterday, said they'd kill them if I don't deliver the final property deeds by tomorrow." Magnolia stepped into the room. "Who took them?" "The railroad men. Webb and his associates. Turns out I was never a partner in this scheme, just another tool to be discarded." Tannen collapsed into a chair. The wealthy land baron who had terrorized families for years now looked like a broken old man. "They've been blackmailing me for 5 years. Said they'd expose my past if I didn't cooperate. I was a fool to think they'd let me live once the job was done." Silas studied Tannen's face. Years of detective work had taught him to read people. This man was genuinely terrified. "What past?" "I was involved in some questionable land deals in Kansas. Nothing compared to this, but enough to ruin me. They found out and used it as leverage." Ruth poured coffee with steady hands. "And Judge Greeley? Same situation. They have evidence of his corruption going back decades. He's as trapped as I am." Magnolia felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into new configurations. The local corruption was just the surface layer. The real conspiracy ran much deeper. "How many people are involved at the federal level?" "I don't know. Webb takes orders from someone in Washington, but he never said who. Someone with access to government survey maps and railroad planning documents." Tannen reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. "These are copies of all my correspondence with the railroad company. Names, dates, payment records, everything." Silas took the envelope and examined its contents. Letters bearing official letterhead. Bank drafts from Northern Pacific Railroad accounts. Evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across state lines. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Magnolia studied the documents with growing excitement. Her father's legal training recognized the significance immediately. Interstate commerce fraud fell under federal jurisdiction. Local courts couldn't protect the conspirators anymore. "We can take this to the federal marshals in Austin," she said. No time, Tannen replied. The railroad representatives are meeting with Greeley this afternoon to finalize the land transfers. Once they have legal ownership, the evidence becomes irrelevant. Ruth leaned forward. What about your family? Tannen's face crumpled. They'll kill them regardless. I know too much. We all do. The room fell silent as the gravity of their situation sank in. They were no longer just fighting for justice. They were fighting for survival. Magnolia walked to the window and looked out at the town square. People went about their daily business, unaware that their community was about to be destroyed by forces beyond their comprehension. There's another way, she said slowly. The others turned to look at her. Something in her voice had changed. The frightened seamstress was gone, replaced by her father's daughter. We hold our own hearing, right here in Millbrook, in public. Force them to defend their actions in front of the people they've been cheating. Silas shook his head. They'll never agree to that. They won't have a choice. We'll present the evidence whether they participate or not. Let the community see the truth. Tannen looked up with the first spark of hope he'd shown. The town charter requires public hearings for major land transactions. I helped write that provision years ago. Then we invoke it. Ruth stood up and straightened her shoulders. I'll spread the word. Tell everyone to meet in the town square at noon. What about Greeley? He won't let this happen. Magnolia picked up her father's case files. 15 years of hidden truth waited to be revealed. Judge Greeley built his power on lies and intimidation. Time to see how it holds up against the law. They spent the morning preparing. Tannen provided inside knowledge of the conspiracy. Silas organized the evidence into a coherent presentation. Ruth rallied the affected families and other townspeople. By 11:30, a crowd had gathered in the square. The same platform where Magnolia had been humiliated now served as her courtroom. She arranged documents on a makeshift table while Silas kept watch for trouble. Judge Greeley appeared at his office window, his face twisted with rage. The railroad representative stood beside him, clearly agitated by this unexpected development. Anna Kowalski arrived with her neighbors. Carlos Martinez brought his entire extended family. The Henderson widow walked slowly but determinedly toward the platform. Word had spread beyond the immediate victims. Shopkeepers, farmers, and townspeople who had watched the corruption for years without speaking up now gathered to hear the truth. Magnolia looked out at the faces in the crowd. Some showed curiosity. Others displayed skepticism. A few revealed the hard anger of people who had been deceived for too long. At exactly noon, she stepped onto the platform where her nightmare had begun. Her father's legal training guided her movements. Her mother's strength steadied her voice. My name is Magnolia Dean. My father was Marcus Dean, attorney at law. He was murdered 15 years ago for investigating the crimes I'm about to reveal. The crowd stirred. Judge Greeley's window slammed shut. The reckoning had begun. Magnolia's voice carried across the packed town square with the authority of inherited justice. She held up the first document, her father's handwriting visible to the crowd. This is evidence of systematic land theft dating back 20 years, forged deeds, backdated sales, murder disguised as accidents. The courthouse door burst open. Judge Greeley stormed toward the platform with Deputy Collins behind him. His face was purple with rage. This gathering is illegal. Disperse immediately or face arrest. Magnolia didn't flinch. Under the town charter, Section 12, any citizen may call for public hearing regarding major land transactions. I invoke that right. The crowd murmured approval. Judge Greeley stopped short, trapped by his own laws. Anna Kowalski stepped forward. My farm was supposedly sold last month. I never signed any papers. She held up the forged documents Magnolia had shown her. Carlos Martinez joined her. Same here. My land was stolen while I recovered from my accident. One by one, the affected families came forward. Each testimony built on the last, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. Judge Greeley tried to interrupt. These people are confused. The legal documents speak for themselves. Yes, they do, Magnolia replied. She displayed the courthouse records alongside the original survey maps. Notice how the handwriting is identical across dozens of supposed sellers. Notice how the dates don't match the timeline of events. Ruth Marlowe climbed onto the platform despite her age. I've been documenting every suspicious death in this town for 15 years. 23 people died under mysterious circumstances. All owned land in the path of the railroad. The crowd's mood shifted from curiosity to anger. People began connecting dots they had ignored for years. Harrison Webb, the railroad representative, appeared at the edge of the square. His expensive suit and confident demeanor marked him as an outsider. He approached the platform with two associates flanking him. "This is a private business matter," Webb announced. "These transactions were conducted legally through proper channels." Magnolia turned to face him directly. "Proper channels that included murder and forgery." Webb's composure slipped slightly. "I resent the implication. Northern Pacific Railroad operates within all applicable laws, including federal laws regarding interstate commerce fraud." The question hung in the air like a sword. Webb's face went pale as he realized how much they knew. Jasper Tannen stepped onto the platform. His presence shocked the crowd into silence. For years, he had been Judge Greeley's most feared enforcer. "I have documents proving this conspiracy reaches into the federal government," Tannen said. His voice shook but held firm. "I was blackmailed into participation. My family was kidnapped when I tried to withdraw." He handed over the envelope of correspondence. Magnolia read key passages aloud. Bank transfers from railroad accounts, orders from unnamed government officials, evidence of a conspiracy spanning multiple states. Judge Greeley made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Tannen is a known criminal. His testimony is worthless." "Then what about this?" Magnolia held up a letter bearing Judge Greeley's official seal. "Your own correspondence authorizing forged property transfers, written in your hand, signed with your name." The judge's face crumpled. 20 years of careful deception unraveled in minutes. Webb tried to retreat toward his carriage, but Silas blocked his path. The detective's years of experience had taught him when criminals were about to run. "Federal marshals are already on their way from Austin," Silas announced. "I sent word yesterday. They should arrive within the hour." The lie was perfectly timed and completely believable. Webb stopped in his tracks, weighing his options. The crowd had grown to include nearly every resident of Millbrook. Shopkeepers closed their stores to witness history. Farmers abandoned their fields. Children climbed trees for better views. Magnolia felt her father's presence as she addressed the community. "Marcus Dean died trying to expose this corruption. Today we finish what he started." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "They killed my Henry for 40 acres of farmland, cut his wagon brake and called it an accident." More testimonies followed. The Kowalski barn fire, the Martinez wagon accident, the suspicious fever that killed the Jackson family patriarch. Each story added weight to the evidence. The pattern was undeniable. Systematic murder disguised as misfortune. Judge Greeley finally broke under the pressure. "I never wanted people to die. Webb threatened to expose my past if I didn't cooperate." "What about my father?" Magnolia asked quietly. "He was getting too close. Webb said he had to be stopped." Greeley's voice was barely a whisper. "I tried to warn him. He wouldn't listen." The confession hit the crowd like a physical blow. Their own judge admitting to murder conspiracy in broad daylight. Real federal marshals arrived before Webb could escape. Silas's lie had become truth through perfect timing. The railroad representatives found themselves in custody within minutes. The next few hours passed in a blur of official statements and legal proceedings. Magnolia guided the process with the legal expertise she had inherited from her father. Property deeds were returned to rightful owners. Forged documents were entered as evidence. The conspiracy's full scope emerged through careful interrogation. 3 months later, Magnolia Dean opened her law practice in the same building where Judge Greeley had once dispensed corrupt justice. Her first clients were families seeking help recovering stolen property. Silas worked beside her as an investigator and partner. Their arranged marriage had evolved into genuine affection built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Ruth Marlowe recovered her health and became the unofficial town historian, documenting the reconstruction of Millbrook's government and community. The town square where Magnolia had once faced humiliation now hosted her weekly legal clinics for families who couldn't afford traditional representation. Justice had finally come to Millbrook, delivered not through violence but through truth, courage, and the power of community united against corruption.